A warm welcome back. My name is Tom, and thanks in advance for tuning into this edition of Get Nuanced. And I apologize for not being as frequent as I'd like with the scheduling of content, especially since I do have, as I mentioned before, a significant backlog that I had been gradually getting to. But in lieu of moving a impromptu trip to my hometown over here, which I'm actually at the moment of Staten Island, which I should still be at while I am in this sort of schedule now that I've been trying to figure out, and should be while I have published this podcast, among others. But I have actually started a part-time job down over in Florida in the good old retail sector that I will broadly just describe as, to not get too specific for the sake of not doxing myself, but my information, as much as anyone else's, is available for those who are the stalker types. I don't recommend doing that, and I focus also on issues that I hope are not just going to affect myself or anyone's particular own interest, but instead transcend and affect the society at large, if not the broader world that we live in and those who inhabit it. And that is exactly why I'd like to revisit, as I had previously done an introduction to, but had not nearly, as I mentioned before, dived into as deep enough as the topic deserves, of Taiwanese geopolitics. And as much as I have deeply regretted not being able to upload as much, which I'm hoping to remedy soon as I figure out the schedule, there has been plenty of interesting developments that have taken place as the cross-strait relations, as they are being referred to, between Taipei and Beijing have obviously, as anyone paying attention could tell you, have taken a significant turn for the worst. And Washington, of course, along with Tokyo, have recently been making several moves, along with Beijing and Taipei, that have indicated that tensions are for certain rising. And this is, of course, one of the most, at least in the 21st century, hotly contested and I think pivotal theaters for conflict between the great powers of our times, as other theaters had been the site for those prior. And in order to understand the broader situation of international relations and the foreign policies of Washington, Beijing, Taipei, and even those such as Tokyo and others that transcend just this Taiwan issue, it is crucial to have the historical context, as well as talk in detail beyond just one particular segment about the meat and potatoes that define this subject. And that is exactly what I plan to do, not just now, but definitely in the future. But at the moment, I had two really interesting subjects, or subtopics, I guess, to dive into when it comes to Taiwanese geopolitics, and that is the recent circumstances I'll discuss in this segment that pertain to an article I'll read, which is titled from Forbes, "The U.S. Air Force is sending dozens of F-22 stealth fighters to practice for war with China," hypothetically speaking. And that hypothetical is actually becoming more and more within the realm of possibility, as even those within the Pentagon have predicted that a potential conflict could be coming as early as 2027, which is not even 7 years away. And with the recent developments of China with their People's Liberation Air Force, I believe, maybe it's referred to something else, or maybe I think it's the PLA Air Force, which is, the PLA is the People's Liberation Army. They have been ramping up the drills that they've been doing, which are also known as sort of the sort of gray zone sort of testing that allows them to, expend the resources, the more finite resources of Taiwan, Taipei, as it attempts to resist the recent encroachments. And obviously there is a fundamental conflict here that is predicated on the exact political status of Taiwan, which has been, ever since 1949, extremely ambiguous. And I've talked about previously the context and background in lieu of the Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang that had previously, since 1911 or 1912, I believe, with the foundation of the Kuomintang by a certain Sun Yat-sen, who is considered the forerunner of the revolution, even in the CCP's China today, being one of the few figures of the Kuomintang who has mutual admiration from both the Chinese communists as well as the Chinese nationalists. And ever since that time, and afterwards until 1949, the Kuomintang had been the ruling class of China, and after they had lost in 1949 the Chinese Civil War against Mao Zedong and his Communist Party compatriots, the government that had previously been based in Nanjing had to relocate to multiple regional other cities across China until finally deciding to flee across the mainland into Taiwan. And ever since, the ROC Republic of China has been de facto and de jure, now in Taiwan. And ever since then, and the failure that Mao had in the 50s to successfully storm and completely wipe out the last political vestiges of the KMT, there has been, with Washington vowing to come to the potential aid of Taiwan, among others, in the event of China attempting to reclaim, or as they put it, which is dubious considering that not since the Qing dynasty has China been, as a polity that had controlled China, had actually exercised political control of Taiwan, other than the ROC in 1949 after Japan, which had gained the island after following the First Sino-Japanese War, had been able to, in the late 1800s or 19th century, retake Taiwan, or not retake, seize Taiwan as part of a stipulation for a peace treaty to that conflict. And following 1945, with Japan losing World War II, which the U.S. and China actually were allied at the time with, this is the China led by the successor of Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, who actually ended up, following the retreat from mainland China, would remain as the leader or dictator or president for life of Taiwan until 1975, putting the island under martial law. And basically, there is a whole situation now that I'll dive into in a moment in the following segment regarding the Kuomintang as it currently exists within the early 21st century, as it had recently seen its complete wipeout following the DPP, or the Democratic Progressive Party, based with the the current ruling party of Taiwan, which had actually been led by Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, who was able to, contrary to the midterms, which had forecasted before the Hong Kong protests, which gave Tsai Ing-wen a boost, the potential defeat of the DPP and the reassertion of a KMT national government, which, in case those that aren't familiar with the subject or didn't understand, the KMT, ironically, which I'll talk about in another segment coming soon, as I mentioned, actually has despite their history, a far more warmer relationship with mainland China and the CCP nowadays than the current DPP ruling party does in Taiwan, as the DPP, the latter, are in favor of Taiwanese independence and potentially forging a national identity completely separate from China, which, of course, for those in Beijing, as much as those probably in the Kuomintang who have pipe dreams of eventually retaking for the ROC the mainland, which never happened. I mean, it's even within question right now whether Taiwan as a polity will be able to independently exist in the future, which I am in favor of full-heartedly, as I mentioned prior, but will provide you with not the black and white view that one side is good and evil in this. And I want to show you how complicated and how nuanced the subject is, as I will want to talk about how the KMT developed over time and is struggling right now itself in the wake of their wipeout against the DPP in 2021 to figure out how they themselves are going to survive. And I think there's a comparable sort of dynamic that you could actually draw from that, and even the domestic politics that I am observing as someone from America, between the Republicans, who I think share a lot of what is going on with the Kuomintang. Maybe not exactly, but I think there's significant overlap that is worth the discussion in and out itself. But before I go too much on a tangent here, I'm definitely going to now dive into this article, which first and foremost will discuss the current situation as it stands in the time that I'm recording this, which is, the date is turning out to be, it's 11:37 p.m. right now on July 27th, 2021, but is soon to be July 28th at 12 a.m. as I am recording this pretty late at night. But just to understand how fluid the situation is and how many developments have already happened since my last recording of doing an introduction to this, and probably, and even in between this and my planned segment on the KMT, the modern KMT, and then even whatever happens afterwards, as I definitely, as I mentioned before, will have to revisit this topic, as so much has been going on with it. And I full-heartedly believe, as someone who is deeply interested in public international relations and foreign policy matters, excuse me, I got a drink of water, that this event will be one of the crucial defining moments for the future 21st century and the geopolitical map as it will stand. And I think for the U.S. in particular, for Washington, which at the moment has been hearing murmurs, both domestically and abroad, of an American decline, quote unquote, which I will get into in its own particular subject, which I think there's merit to the overall notion. However, I don't think by any means that a definitive collapse is inevitable, contrary to some of the more gloomy and I think more nihilistic observers, some of which I think are not even the least intelligent, but I think themselves have extrapolated a little bit, which I will get into and why I personally disagree with that. But let's get into Taiwan right now, as I think that this event, as much as maybe those who are more non-interventionist might, as someone who used to be a lot more non-interventionist, would like to think, unfortunately, I think our prestige, at least when it comes to American soft power, and especially in the future when it comes to national security as a whole, especially in this Pacific region, which, keep in mind, Taiwan and whoever is able to dominate this particular island will be able to effectively, in the case of China, which it aspires to do, be able to control the three-island chain and be able to effectively not have to deal with any blockade in the case of China that could have happened right now if the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, among others, along with the U.S., were to try to practice one against Beijing. And I recently saw a very interesting segment by Shervan from Caspian Report, which I'll recommend that you all check out below, about how the dynamics of naval power are one that Beijing, based off of the prior century of humiliation that it had suffered against the Western powers that were colonizing it along with Japan. This is a circumstance here that Beijing is very much interested in and interested in countering. And in order for us, as those especially within the American sort of audience, for us to properly contextualize and maybe be able to, stand up to China and Beijing and actually do it in a way that's not only intelligent and thoughtful, but also giving not just, an adversary a run for their money, but respecting and acknowledging the history and understanding their motivations and not thinking that they're just some sort of, superhero, supervillain caricature of what they are really. And I think it's very complicated. And to say that there is a purely good or evil side, I think would be very much naive. And I'll talk about that in the broader philosophies that I tend to try to implement when I understand and observe these events as well as analyze them in another segment. But in this case, let's get into this article from Forbes, which I'll link in the description below, and as well I will also read another article tied to this before getting into another segment separately about the KMT that I think will aid in understanding this evolving situation and how it will ultimately shape up. And I'll give my predictions, but again, there will be conjecture, and I really recommend that after all this that you all have, if you haven't already, continue to do your due diligence and research this topic. I'll include resources in the description below. Again, do not take my word for anything. I am just somebody incredibly interested in this, and I'm hoping you all share similar sentiments. But I recommend that we all are continuing to keep up to date and doing our own proper diligence when it comes to analyzing these events as they are changing by the day, and I think are getting rather intense, especially when you hear about, and I'll discuss how China has recently on their state media threatened to nuke Japan, and that is something that itself I think is worth its own topic and video that I'll probably get into. But that alone is not an isolated event and is part of this broader situation, as it was in response to Japan's prime minister at this time, the successor of Shinzo Abe, I think Suga or someone along the lines. I'm not 100% sure what his name is, but the current prime minister, as I will talk about in the future with Japan, I have a rather nuanced take on them as well, as someone who is ethnically Korean, but was raised in the States here. And I think when it comes to the situation with them vowing to stand side by side with Washington to defend Taiwan and its democratic system, as much as I don't consider myself a liberal, and I also am not necessarily in an absolute sense the hugest proponent of democracy, I do think Taiwan's independence is not only within the national security interest of the United States, but I also think that to potentially leave them and abandon them to the devices of Beijing, when the CCP had never officially at any point controlled this island, at least not de facto, maybe de jure, to adhere to their one China, two systems policy, when we saw what happened with Hong Kong and how they went back on their word. And maybe there was some sort of asymmetric warfare, hybrid warfare going on with the U.S. being a sort of more belligerent force than they would like to be out painted themselves out to be. That being included in my particular analysis, which I try to, again, not look at the US or China as black and white, good and evil, this sort of caricature that oftentimes, unfortunately, many boil down these sort of situations to. I'm trying to be as realistic here as possible, and I'm relying on very limited information, and I only have so much time to be involved with all this, as I mentioned, as I am pretty busy, but definitely would like to do this in the long term for a full-time gig beyond my potential interest in the future also for running for Congress. But that's all projects in the future. But when it comes to not just talking about my personal stances, but when it comes to Taiwan as a whole and understanding why China or Beijing is so gung-ho about retaking this quote-unquote renegade province, it really makes a lot of sense when you understand it's the same sort of motivations that are fueling this current great power conflict between China and America, or Washington and Beijing, and even Washington and Moscow. And it was the same impetus that had inspired similar sorts of conflicts, such as the Great Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 20th century. But I digress, and I mean, those weren't even events that were that long ago, for crying out loud. My parents in their 60s grew up at that time, and as much as some things change, a lot of things do stay the same, and I think when it comes to politicking and the search and quest for power, I think that maybe the players change, but the game is usually, unfortunately, for better and for worse, all too much the same, and technology evolves as well and changes how the game is played. But when it comes to, for example, the situation with China and Taiwan, and even with that being sort of extrapolated further to the conflicts I just mentioned prior, it simply is predicated on this very fact that you have in Taiwan, and it's despite whatever it is doing now, as I do think it's worth mentioning, and it will be further discussed in the KMT video that I plan on talking about and podcast segment. But when it comes to the situation with these sort of, unresolved political status, and Taiwan actually having a younger population that is increasingly wanting to develop their own individual national identity, completely divorced from China. And the KMT really has represented, especially since they had democratized after Chiang Ching-kuo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, had loosened the authoritarian sort of status that it had been able to dominate ever since the KMT had fled in 1949 to Taiwan following the Chinese Civil War, as I mentioned. We saw with the DPP being able to take power and the KMT even currently being a minority party, that the Wai-Ching-ren, the mainland Chinese, the 1.2 to 2 million Chinese that had fled with Chiang Kai-shek, many of them being anti-communist or in one way reason or another fearing the takeover that the CCP, the Communist Party of China, had done with Mao in the 1940s, that this increasingly aged population that had come with him, their future generations, their next of kin, are younger people themselves, having been raised on Taiwan, who I think increasingly are also less willing, especially with the belligerence of Beijing, to have this sort of dual Chinese-Taiwan identity, and are more seeing themselves increasingly as Taiwanese than Chinese, even though they are ethnically Han Chinese, despite having a different sort of dialect from Mandarin and having a unique sort of cultural context separate as from the mainland, even though some of their ancestors, in the case of the Wai-Ching-ren, had come from the mainland since the 40s, in between the situation that when Japan had transferred the island over to the Republic of China, which is in fact a rump state, despite its claims. It does not exercise control over mainland China or any of the other territories it has disputes with, including Mongolia and the South China Sea territories. But, in fact, due to the nature of this situation, for them to abandon those claims and to seek an independent Chinese or independent Taiwanese identity, that is a non-starter in the eyes of Beijing, and that is why they are completely determined, are increasingly showing their teeth and showing how serious that they are taking this, and that I think we need to believe them when they say that they are determined to take Taiwan by force and act accordingly. We can't just assume that they're just trolling, bro, or doing any sort of, bluff, considering that a lot rides on Xi Jinping's legacy and his reputation, as he has painted himself as the new Mao Zedong, or the greatest leader of the CCP in China since Mao Zedong. And to understand that recently the centenary of the creation of the Communist Party of China had just happened. There was this celebration, which I saw on YouTube, and they're definitely trying to show, not just symbolically, but even through their drills that they're doing with the flights over Taiwan recently with their fighter jets and their increased naval patrols and harassing of the Matsu and I think other islands that are in between the straits. We're seeing a situation that I am 100% convinced is going to escalate into something serious. And whether the U.S., whether Washington and those within America, whether you're myself or someone like me, a random citizen, or whether you are a politician, a policymaker, or even in the Pentagon, somewhere within the halls of power in Washington and its bureaucracy, we got to accept reality and stop beating around the bush and see that China is serious about this. And if we're not serious about this, and if we are willing to abandon Taiwan and our allies in a time where they need us the most, much like what's going on in Afghanistan, which I have very mixed feelings on as someone who doesn't personally believe we should have gone there to begin with. However, I do criticize, I think, the way that we have departed with Biden, seemingly not even willing to discuss this as much as I might understand why he might want to be tired and fatigued of this conflict. The way that we've left, giving about 90%, I think already, correct me if I'm wrong, of the territory, which I'll talk about, to the Taliban. This is a disaster. This was bad. This also showed that we have left many of our allies, the translators and people that had helped. I actually think that alone, again, is really unacceptable. But with Taiwan, in the event, I think that we were to just allow China to seize Taiwan, minus the human and cost and the amount of people probably that would be on both sides in China and Taiwan, casualties, this would make Japan's situation, as much as I have my issues historically with them, this would make their national security situation completely untenable. They would have to rearm and become, which I don't think that they should. I am very distrustful of their government, but I do think, in the sake of being practical, a strategic alliance between Seoul and Tokyo, unless they want Pyongyang and Beijing to win along with Moscow, is 100% necessary. And I will discuss that in a future segment, but to stay with Taiwan, this situation will have reverberating effects for the entire broader region, the Indo-Pacific region. And if the U.S. is going to not stand its ground and really show, my whole goal here would be ultimately to avoid a war, be ready if necessary. In order to actually obtain genuine peace, we have to prepare for war and prepare for the worst circumstances possible. And at any rate, if we are able to show that we're not just committed, but we are going to just outright tell them, in like the event of what happened with China threatening to nuke Japan, contrary to them promising that they would not be resorting in any circumstance to a nuclear first strike. Cut that bullshit out. And when it comes to the sort of, this sort of Japan exception theory, again, I'm not a fan of Tokyo, the government there, and I'll talk about the Olympics recently and how their own people are protesting it, which I think is so symbolic of Japan and their government, which I hate their government. I don't hate the people of Japan, but the government, the elites that run it, yeah, the emperor there, fuck these people. When it comes to those people, unless they're going to be actually sincere with apologizing to Seoul, I don't think that Seoul is trying to seek a further apology. They've done what they're going to. You can bring a horse to water, you can't force it to drink. Seoul has to get over, Moon Jae and all these folks have to get over themselves, and they have to work with Tokyo, I think, but we need to still be realistic and still say, listen, we're not friends. Korea and Japan, at least in the context of Korea and Japan. But at the end of the day, if we don't work together in the case of both of them and work with Washington, the United States, where I'm from here, despite being born in Seoul, but definitely being raised here in the United States, talking here from New York, then in that case, if they're not willing to put aside history and cooperate on this in the interest of both of their survival, a house is only as good as its foundation, and you're only as strong as your weakest link. And if you're going to do that, that's a suicidal move. But when it comes to this sort of situation with grave uncertainty, with an increasing situation following the pandemic, where the U.S.'s influence and capacity to be a leader is within constant threat, and much to its own, fault, I think, which I'll talk about in future segments, we need to make sure that when it really counts, we need to stand up and be ready to take on China and Russia, and also make sure that they understand, at least with China, that you shouldn't even try it. We should make it so that we will, in some ways, maybe either create some sort of NATO equivalent in the Pacific, with countries that have similar values and interests, and an interest in also making sure that China is not just able to run roughshod. And their ridiculous claim to having complete hegemony over the South China Sea just underscores how imperialistic that they are. And I'm willing to acknowledge that America has an empire, but its values have shown that it is not willing to outright just claim that entire areas are, especially with those other sovereign countries existing, neighboring and having their own worthwhile claims, such as Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, and even Taiwan, which I still think deserves to be, at least based on its current system and how it's been running, a very effective COVID prevention program, which I'll talk about in another segment. I think there has been some hiccups recently. There's been multiple instances which we've seen that they are a genuine alternative to what is the so quote unquote this song I remember hearing, which is very catchy, but it is not the spirit of it very and all true. Without the Communist Party, there is no new China. No, I mean, Taiwan shows that there can be a Han Chinese or Chinese sort of political system that is an alternative to Beijing and what they're offering, that doesn't necessarily have to be anti-free speech, in the sense that in China, if you criticize their government and you're a citizen there, they don't treat their citizens that great. I mean, maybe there's an increasing middle class and also their elites, all right. But if you're a dissident in China and you criticize them, bad things are going to happen to you. And I can say here in America, listen, I've said it on other segments, I support the release of Julian Assange. I think in certain situations, you could say, fuck the politicians in Washington. They're just like us. They're people just like us. They're fallible. Maybe some of them have deeper pockets than us, but they are by no means intrinsically superior than any other average American. I've met plenty of average people in this country that I think I would trust far more than someone like Pelosi or McConnell. Just my perspective. But here the difference is you can say that. There is a rule of law here. We have certain sort of constitutional protections, and we have a system that is far from perfect, but is one that I think, as much as with the idea of a more perfect union, is something that can be improved and refined over time. In China, there is no discussion of any of that, and we saw with how they tried to conceal COVID and a lot of this sort of dubious situations we see, which the U.S. might have been involved in with the government at least, when it comes to this Wuhan lab and all this other stuff, which I really am not in the position. I'm not a medical expert, and I also don't know it all. My guess is as good as anyone, but I am an observer of these events and keeping up with them. It's something to keep in mind, and it really just shows, regardless of what the case is, that China is not the sort of country that is going to just openly acknowledge when it fails on something. Much like with the Soviets with Chernobyl, they are very much inclined when, especially there's even others going to be affected by their own intransigence, their own errors, to just, sweep those under the rug and to lie and then sort of persecute those, such as the doctors in Wuhan, who were trying to actually give a heads up to people that were outside of China that this was going on and an issue. We have seen enough, I think, from China. None of their propaganda on CGN or the Global or any of the Global Times or any of these things. Listen, you can say whatever you want. There's criticisms in the United States that I think we should definitely talk about. And the one thing about politicians here is, at least they're not advocating, at least fully yet, to just kidnapping people in the middle of the night for simply expressing dissident political views. And I've criticized Mitch McConnell. I'll criticize the Democrats and Republicans, Pelosi, Biden, Trump, etc. But the difference is, at least these people aren't going to ruin your life if you criticize them. Try talking about Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. As much as I think they're interesting figures and very intelligent, I think we should give them their respect and acknowledge that these are serious competitors. They're adversaries. We should treat them and respect them and handle them as such, not have this sort of goofy misconception that we'll be their buddies, that we can just all get along and just gather around kumbaya, world peace. Anyone who seriously believes that, I really wish that we could live in that world, but that is not the world we are living in. And if we're going to properly be able to do anything about Taiwan, as I'm going to read this article, sorry for going off on a tangent here, and be able to not just with Taiwan do what we need to, but also be able to improve the U.S. domestically and also abroad, not just be the worst kind of caricature that our detractors, our competitors have painted us out to be, and sometimes in our worst moments maybe have demonstrated we're capable of being, much like they are, as among others. We need to just, obviously that doing otherwise and fixing these sorts of issues and being serious about them, it's the only way forward, and that is exactly why I, among others, are interested in these topics and will continue to discuss them. But as I digress right now, I want to talk about, as much as there is an alternative government here, or alternative political system, that threatens the prestige and legitimacy of China, as they are also planning, or they at least planned, with Xi Jinping at the helm, to have Taiwan back at their orbit, annexed by one means or another, whether peacefully or through cultural subversion or some other means, which I'll discuss in a future segment, about soft power and hybrid warfare, which are very interesting topics I've mentioned a little bit about, but deserve their own segment. The situation when it comes to the 2049, 100th anniversary of the establishment of the PRC, we need to understand the timetables and the symbolic significance of these dates, and understand that they understand the window of opportunity for them with their aging population in the mainland, and what will probably be a stagnating system where you'll see the middle class that's developing will be increasingly prone to, as much as we saw in the US with the development of the middle class here, begin to question and challenge the predominant narratives of the society. And that could be said about any country when you're talking about a similar sort of context and socioeconomic situation, which is worth its own interesting discussion on a conceptual level in another segment. But same with the US and China being ideologically and sort of when it comes to their values being opposed. As I mentioned with the Taiwan-China situation, this sort of broader concept extrapolates over to why they're at an impasse and why these sort of prevailing notions are mutually exclusive and are the situation is being resorted to a conflict potentially that could even, in a worst case scenario, lead to a hot war and might even have to be inevitably. But let's talk about the circumstances of the recent developments here before I further go on, as we're reaching the half-hour mark here. Alright, so I just did a brief pause to actually grab a little bit more water, but I'm back, and I'm actually going to read these two articles, the one I mentioned before from Forbes, and also another one related to this subject by Newsweek. And let's get into it, but I also want to mention really quick that I will also include additional resources and references such as the gray zone tactics that have been developed by China as a way to, in the long term, as it prepares to reintegrate Taiwan, as it says, quote unquote, by any means necessary, ideally peacefully, as Xi Jinping has said, but also, if necessary, they said they would resort to force because they perceive this to be, through their own cultural and political perspective, to be their sovereign territory. And I personally am one to dispute that. However, I want to keep in mind that these are Han Chinese ethnic people, that this is one of those sorts of things that was an unresolved vestige, much like the Korean Peninsula and the situation on the Korean Peninsula of the Cold War, or at least the first iteration that happened in the 20th century, where it was mostly between Moscow and Washington, the Soviets and Americans at the time. But in this situation, where we're talking about this newer Cold War with China, which I think is more complicated, and the dynamics, of course, are different from the relationship with the Soviets and the succeeding one between the Americans of today and the Russians of the Russian Federation, which, at the end of the day, I think is worth its own discussion. However, now, talking about this situation with Taiwan and in this article is going to be this, what I think to be really well put together piece, and I'll include below. Obviously, take everything with a grain of salt. However, it does provide the sort of context. And obviously, as I mentioned before, there will be additional things in the description that I recommend you check out, but it's up to you. And let's get into this. The U.S. Air Force is sending dozens of F-22 stealth fighters to practice for war with China. And this is by David Axe and is in the category of aerospace and defense. The U.S. Air Force is deploying a huge force of fighters, including a possibly unprecedented number of F-22s, to Guam to practice for war with China. The 10 F-15Es from the 389th Fighter Squadron at Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho are already at the ground at the Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, which is an outpost in the Pacific that the U.S. has to project its influence. And we can have a separate discussion about the hundreds of U.S. military bases and the broader nature of U.S. foreign policy. Feel free to disagree with me at any point. I mean, I'm sure that there's those depending on their own particular political views and also their own origins and their culture. They'll have differing perspectives, maybe with some overlap, maybe with some other stuff, and maybe not so much on this issue or vice versa. It's up to you to decide. I'm telling you what I think, and I'll leave the conclusions that you will draw for yourselves. And feel free to disagree, but just know that I am not going to necessarily take those disagreements and ultimately, have to do anything like give a shit about them. But, that's what makes, at least here in the U.S. at the moment, the free speech thing, I think, is still a good thing. The First Amendment. We could talk about that in a broader subject, but hey, let's get into this now. So, the 25 F-22s from two squadrons, the 525th Fighter Squadron at Joint Base Elmendorf, Richardson, Alaska, and the 199th Fighter Squadron, part of the Hawaii Air National Guard at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam, should also arrive soon. Two C-130J transports from the 374th Airlift Wing at Yokota Air Base, Japan, are accompanying the fighters. The C-130s and other support planes are critical to what happens next. Under the rubric of exercise Pacific Iron 21, the fighters will spread out across 4 airfields: 3 Anderson, A.B. Juan Platt International Airport, and Northwest Field, which is in Guam. And then there's 1 Tinan International Airport, which lies 120 miles north of Guam. The plan, according to Air Force releases, is for the fighters to practice deploying to and flying sorties from austere airfields. The flying branch in recent years has grown increasingly worried that in the early hours of regional war, the Chinese People's Liberation Army rocket force might fire scores of ballistic missiles at big U.S. bases, including Anderson. Under the new quote-unquote agile combat employment, end quote, I actually did that wrong, but it was quote and then at the end of employment, end quote, my bad. A little bit of an oral grammatical error, but forgive me for that. And that is a concept the Air Force would scatter its plane across dozens of small airstrips within this in the Western Pacific, all in the hope of complicating China's bombardment. Some of the airstrips, such as Northwest Field in Guam, are left over from World War II. And then there is another quote here. ACE is the use, or ACE is the use of agile operations to generate resilient air power in a contested environment, and is designed to organize, train, and equip airmen to be more agile in operation execution, strategic in deterrence, and more resilient in capabilities, the Air Force stated. There is actually a really handy map, I think, that's from Google Maps embedded on this Forbes article, which I will recommend and include below the link. And it gives you an interesting and I think very insightful, as I think obviously according to the broader notions I believe of international relations, that understanding the geography in these sorts of circumstances is pivotal. And much of history has been defined as much by us people as it has been by our surrounding geography. And in this sort of context, when we're talking about the broader Indo-Pacific theater, which is, of course, where Taiwan and this whole situation is taking place in, this map gives you an interesting and more visual representation of the state of play and the geographical overlays and how the positioning of these territories is ultimately determining how the circumstances and the strategies from each respective parties are going to be configured. But we can talk about that in a little bit more, and let's finish the article. So the Air Force for years has been practicing this dispersal concept, but rarely with so many fighters, to say nothing of so many stealth fighters, which are a different sort of iteration there that have different capabilities. We can talk about that in the future, but when it comes to the F-22, like all low observable warplanes, they require extensive maintenance between sorties. That can be hard to do at an airstrip without permanent facilities. The presence of the C-130s and the force mix for the Pacific Iron 21 is telling. It's one thing to land a bunch of F-22s on some disused runway and then throw up some tents for the crews and maintainers. It's quite another to keep the planes and airmen supplied with food, fuel parts, and ammunition. To keep the austere bases combat ready in wartime, the Air Force would need to sustain a steady rhythm of resupply missions. Moreover, many of the potential outlying bases the Air Forces has identified for potentially to use during a crisis lie hundreds of miles from likely combat zones over the Philippine Sea and the China Seas. The fighters would need support from aerial tankers, lots of it. Air refueling is critical to agile combat employment because it extends the aircraft's range and duration of flight, U.S. Transportation Command tweeted last month. Those tankers are too big to safely operate from austere airstrips. While the Air Force might succeed in spreading out its fighters in order to protect them from Chinese rockets, the service could struggle to do the same for its tankers and transport planes. Likewise, America's heavy bombers depend on big air bases. At least 3 B-52s from the 5th Bomb Wing at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota arrived at Anderson last week. KC-135 tankers are usually accompanying these to Guam bomber rotations. The logistical demands of, quote, distributed, end quote, air operations, represent a major challenge. All of those F-15s and F-22s dispersing around Guam should be impressive, but it'd be even more impressive to see the Air Force support those scattered fighters in a way that the Chinese can't shut down with a few rockets. And that is the end of the article. I'll include it below. But to summarize and provide my analysis of it, which really is offering insight on the situation. We are quickly heating up in this Cold War to a situation that might be akin, even in its severity and potential scale of its significance, as the Cuban Missile Crisis was for the situation that had been involved with JFK and Khrushchev in the 60s, when my parents were actually growing up, way back when. And that should tell you how important this issue is. And to even provide broader context here, keeping in mind, as I recently discussed with someone who thought, and it's easy to understand, that these events might seem so foreign and far away at distant places. If you're someone like myself who lives both in New York and in Florida, and those are both thousands of miles away from Taiwan and China, let alone the broader Indo-Pacific theater and the continent of Asia and all that, it's easy for us to, especially with the human tendency to really focus in on the nearest things within our own direct periphery, to miss the bigger picture here, especially since many of the devices here that we often can take for granted, regardless of who you are here, at least if you are someone in the West who has access to things like a microphone and computer, as I'm having right now, to record this sort of podcast and also be able to do what I do on the internet. And that is something that is something that we need to understand is due to the assembly of tons of complicated parts, especially those that are derived from TSMC based in Taiwan, especially the chips that power our devices and allow them to run and play the games that many of those tend to think, are great, but ultimately are very much contingent on access to these supply chains and these technologies, which in the event of a CCP aggressive invasion that is successful, that takes over Taiwan and re-annexes it, would, for so many reasons geopolitically, be a devastating loss to the U.S. and one that I think would cripple and really decisively mark the turning point in which where the East, at least in these sorts of polemical discussions where we talk about East versus West, really had overcome the West, or at least so-called. And I think it's far more complicated than that, especially since Taiwan is an Eastern country. And I think that the ideologies, at least at play here, really are more complicated. And there's a lot of other elements here beyond just ideology, including the military elements, as well as also the geopolitical aspects, which I want to talk about further. But what this article basically is summing up is the ultimate disadvantage that the U.S. has from a geographical point of view, considering that mainland China is right across the straits. These cross-strait tensions are called that for a reason, and China has far more logistical maneuverability and the ability to do so much in terms of their operations that the U.S., especially even considering its own superpower status in the military that the U.S. has, relatively speaking, still an impressive, for sure, military presence. And I don't think it's without question that Taiwan could be defended by us, which I think in the case of China, I mean, just don't take my word for it. Look at their actions. I think if they could have already for 100% known that they could have succeeded in overcoming the government in Taipei and reestablishing their control de facto instead of just de jure, they would have probably did it already. And I think there's some reasons, especially considering the population crisis and the economic situation as it's developing in China. I think there's a lot of variables at play here which ultimately can show that China in some ways is as much a glass cannon here as the U.S., and that if they were to lose this and aren't 100% certain they could do this, this would lead to their own sort of political disaster and potentially the complete erosion of political legitimacy for the Communist Party in China, based in Beijing. And it would also tarnish Xi Jinping's legacy and completely dent this notion that he is the new Mao Zedong, or the greatest ruler of the Chinese people since him. But keep in mind also, I mean, there's this high stakes game here, and there is much that could be lost and too much at stake for both sides, I think. And that is why we're seeing neither back down. And we're seeing also the fact that these bases, many of them, one of the problems that the U.S. has come across, especially with the Air Force, that they've even acknowledged, is the fact that a lot of these bases are not permanent and modern facilities. A lot of those are still holdovers from World War II that were used during the campaign that the U.S. had against the Japanese, which, keep in mind, as much as they were in their own times formidable, that was decades ago, and I'm sure that they probably need to be renovated and improved and upgraded, but obviously it doesn't sound like they're in that position. And considering the time-sensitive nature of this sort of situation, and that a conflict is, as predicted by the Pentagon, could be coming as early as 2027, and that, keeping in mind the goal of Xi Jinping before the end of his tenure he still has, I think, over a decade left, considering his age, much like Putin in Russia, who has a little bit of gas left, I think, metaphorically speaking, to continue to, be the dictator or president for life, depending on what you want to refer to them as, in Moscow and Beijing, respectively. However, in the case of Xi Jinping, by 2049, that is going to mark the 100th anniversary, much as the recent centenary anniversary of the founding of the CCP. That will have marked the foundation of the PRC and the 100th anniversary of the end, the decisive end, at least, in terms of the mainland conflict between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China, respectively. And that really goes to show you that within 28 years, if this goal is to be kept, especially considering, as I mentioned in past segments, I recommend checking out, that the youth in Taiwan are increasingly developing their own sorts of attitude that they do not want to be considered Chinese. We're seeing with the changes in their passport recently to further emphasize Taiwan and the ROC sort of influence in terms of the symbolic and even just practical presence it has, along with the Kuomintang as a political party, have been showing that they are in the wake of Taiwan, and recently the DPP's influence have been, gradually giving way and are especially not looking like they are in the dominant sort of, opinion. I mean, it looked like that around 2008, but that was the last time, I believe, or at least, yes, I believe so. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but that would probably be around the last time. Yes, that was Ma Ying-jeou, who was one of the last, I think, sort of Kuomintang presidents, and I think, he was actually born in Hong Kong. Many of the newer people from the generation, such as myself, the millennials, and I guess even Gen Z, have been in the face of what's been going on in Hong Kong and just in general with China being very much so belligerent and seeming not to want to acknowledge or even entertain independence, which in my practical point of view, I think maybe we could support Taiwanese independence, at least autonomy from China in the political sense, and potentially as a negotiating chip if they were to in some way be able to decisively, give up the notion of aggressively seizing this territory. Maybe there can be some sort of symbolic victory on their part for them to save face. But when it comes to the practical de facto control, not the de jure, but de facto, Taiwan, I think firmly, at least in my point of view, from the American point of view here, foreign policy-wise, should remain independent. And there is a lot at stake here, as I mentioned, with TSMC, and going beyond that when we talk about the geopolitical situation that would be decisively within the favor of Beijing and China, and at the detriment of our regional allies as well as just the U.S. as a whole. And I think that is something that we need to keep in mind, and also the fact that the military bases that are being used are, by their own acknowledgement from the armed forces, clearly not up to snuff. And there's a lot of reason to believe that the PRC has been modernizing, and relatively speaking, the gap between Washington and Beijing from a military point of view has been lessening and lessening. And that also goes to the broader notions of this sort of multipolar world that we're looking like they're heading towards. And someone who does have a largely pro-US worldview, but still wants to be based in a nuanced reality. And I also am tolerant and can understand when other folks, like obviously Putin or Xi Jinping, are going to be their nationalist or patriotic for their own country. Obviously, if they're the leaders, they should be doing that in their own context. But that does not mean we shouldn't be opposing them, but we should respect and acknowledge and be aware of the histories of their peoples, and also understand the best ways forward, in the sense that in order to overcome our adversaries or enemies, we need to know them. And in the case of this Taiwan issue, it requires far more than this segment, and I think as well deserves another article that I'm going to talk about very quickly, which will further contextualize the complicated and increasingly tense, which is an understatement, that situation that is unfolding here. Let's get into it. So, all right, this article is from John Feng of Newsweek, and that will be included in the description below. Again, keep in mind these articles, much like myself and anybody, has their own bias, and to obviously read between the lines, come to your own conclusions, but also keep in mind the broader, bigger picture here, the context which I'm trying to convey, and why this is such, whether you agree with me or not, a situation that you should be concerned about and should actually be actively keeping up with, as I am, as many others are, and as you hopefully still are too as well. And if you're not, you should be. But let's get into it. So, China warned of, quote, serious consequences, end quote, for trespassing in its airspace on Thursday, which was, this article being written, keep in mind, was on last week, or 2 weeks ago, July 15th, 2021. And that is what they said on Thursday, hours after U.S. Air Force delivered, quote, diplomatic mail, unquote, to the de facto U.S. Embassy in Taipei, which is the American Institute, which is, since due to the 1979 circumstances and us acknowledging the PRC and this sort of situation where there are two contesting claims and the broader history of the Kuomintang and CCP with China and Taiwan, there is this acknowledgement that was made ever since Carter's administration going forward that in lieu of warming relations, ever since Nixon had done that historic visit to China and afterwards subsequent events, that we were then going to acknowledge that the government in Beijing was the legitimate China, which I still actually would agree with. However, the reality is there is an independent government, and whatever the ROC was and has become into, or isn't become into, has become or hasn't become yet, it still is clearly its own individual polity that has independence and its own independent foreign policy, elected government, political ideology, and political institutions. I think they have their own currency and their own unique cultural context, which are all, I think, reasons to actually, especially they have a lot of overlap and convergence with the U.S., should be considered allies, and not just strategic allies, but those that we should be honoring the commitments that were made by past leaders within the government. And the people here in the U.S. also had tacitly, I guess, through the elections and political process, have, signed off on. And we could dispute those, and obviously I think you can be, again, you can have your own disagreements here, and maybe even think that we shouldn't aid them. But this is my perspective on this, and regardless if you agree or disagree, again, keep in mind this bigger picture of what is going on. So let's finish here. A C-146A Wolfhound, typically used by Air Force Special Operations Command, left Okinawa's Kadena Air Base in Japan before landing at Songshan Airport in Taiwan's capital at 9:32 a.m. local time, according to publicly available flight tracking data. Wu Qin, a spokesperson for Chinese Defense Ministry, and probably, this is my opinion, I'm just saying here, one of these so-called wolf warriors, but again, let's go back to the article, said in an online statement that Beijing had expressed its, quote, serious concern, quote, over the stopover, which lasted just over half an hour. Taiwan is part of China's sacred and inalienable territory, Wu said. Any foreign military aircraft that lands on Chinese territory must obtain permission from the government of the People's Republic of China, end quote. Then there's another quote. Any foreign ships or planes trespassing in Chinese airspace will trigger serious consequences, he added. Taiwan's foreign ministry spokesperson, Joanne Yu, told Newsweek that the government would offer, quote, no comments and no further explanation, end quote, about Thursday's brief visit. I guess that settles it, According to Taiwan's TVBS News, the flight manifest showed no passengers on the plane, which had requested a stop lasting no longer than 90 minutes from local authorities. It took off 34 minutes later at 10:06 a.m. The news report said that the aircraft had delivered items intended for the handover at the American Institute in Taiwan, which I mentioned earlier, whose outgoing director, Brent Christensen, returned to the U.S. via Taiyuan Airport on Thursday morning after a 3-year posting. His successor, Sandra Udirk, arrived in Taipei on Monday and is in mandatory quarantine. It was the first time, quote, diplomatic mail, end quote, had been delivered to Taiwan by chartered aircraft, Taipei's Apple Daily reported, presumably referring to the 4 decades since Washington ended formal ties with Taipei in 1979, as I mentioned before. And then the Chinese government claims the island nation as one of its provinces, and as I mentioned before too, despite the lacking any practical jurisdiction over Taiwan. Again, this is what we've heard before, but it's important context, so I'll keep it in mind. Beijing lodged similar stern protest after delegations of 3 U.S. senators visited Taipei for the 3 hours on June 6th. They had arrived in the back of a U.S. Air Force C-17 Goldmaster III, with the military transport plane making headlines on both sides of the strait. And I think that had been one of the highest diplomatic delegations and was considerably comparable to when Joe Biden had invited the Taiwanese to come, their political delegation, their representative in Washington, to come to his inauguration, which is the first time since we have had a Chinese or ROC Taiwanese, depending on which perspective you have, person visiting from the ROC on behalf of the ROC government in Taiwan. And in the case of the situation with Trump when he took the phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, which I don't even know 100% if that was on purpose or maybe he didn't realize the politically sensitive nature of the situation. But I'm sure afterwards he had soon probably learned if he didn't, and that was definitely historic, whether it was intended to or not, as again it reinforces, since the notions passed, that we would formally acknowledge that China, the government in Beijing, and no longer acknowledge the ROC, which is in practicality just the island of Taiwan, and is the government in Taipei, which runs this, but has still the political vestiges of the ROC, which was founded by the Kuomintang and obviously the original founder, Sun Yat-sen, who, again, as I mentioned before, is actually someone venerated from both sides of the straits, ironically enough, as much as he is with Chiang Kai-shek, somewhat of a controversial figure due to the situation that Taiwan had actually faced before it became the home base and the site of the ROC following the Chinese Civil War, which I'll talk about in another segment. And let's get back now and finish this article. So here, let's finish here. On April 14th, China also disapproved of a less formal visit by 3 retired U.S. officials. The personal delegation sent by President Joe Biden affirmed Washington's continued support for Taiwan, including its self-defense. Thursday's statement by the Chinese Defense Ministry, issued about 5 hours after the cargo plane had left Taipei, warned the U.S. that it was, quote, playing with fire, end quote. And that is something that is familiar rhetoric if you're familiar with the situation, and potentially is true, but I think that that's something that we're probably all well aware of if you're involved as an analyst or somebody who's actively a policymaker on both sides of the situation. Whether you're from Beijing or Washington or a supporter of either, it is clear what the situation is. And I mean, this is supposed to be a warning, and sort of a veiled threat. However, it doesn't sound like, clearly based off of the situation as it was prior with these formerly similar warnings that, much came of it. However, that could be similarly like anything else, subject to change, and we need to be aware of these things and also have a coherent analysis and understanding of these things if we're going to actually be able to formulate an effective policy and hopefully a sort of preventative measure that could be sort of a situation where we don't even have to fight a war and maybe China could save face. However, they would have to maintain a de facto independence in Taiwan. Anything else, I think, would be a non-starter for a negotiation. However, it looks like, we're both digging our heels in here, and it's going to be interesting how these developments shape up. And there was another quote that they actually said, which I'll finish with this article, I guess, and link it in the description. Sorry for mentioning. I forgot it was there, but I definitely think it's an interesting note to include at the very end. The Taiwanese government, it added, was, quote, leading wolves into the womb, end quote, using a Chinese idiom that can be interpreted as they're inviting danger. And I think that including Taipei is aware of the circumstances here, and it looks like there is a showdown in the Pacific. And this is going to be something, as I mentioned before, with China even now threatening Japan, since they have recently have committed to the defense of Taiwan, as it is within their own geopolitical and strategic interest. And I think that's something that's worth its own separate conversation and discussion. I gave my thoughts a little bit earlier about why I think the Chinese to knock that sort of stuff off. And I think that there is a broader discussion that I want to have involving this situation, as there's another story I would like to talk about involving South Korea and Japan's relations, even North Korea to an extent, and the situation with the comfort women, which I think is one that personally, as a Korean American, still is something that I consider as an important issue. However, but as someone raised here, as someone who wants to put American interest first and foremost, as I'm from here, and the future of the country, and the sacrifices made by those who came before all of us and will be here after us, and those who come after us are going to be things that I think drive not just us as people here in America, but also is one of the driving motivations for many of the leaders of the world that are among the more serious, even if they're ideologically opposed to us. And that includes Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, among others, who I think as much as we could stand against them, we should acknowledge that they are intelligent and they're well aware of the circumstances, what's at stake, and I think we cannot underestimate them. And that as much as those seem to joke about like North Korea or China in the past, I think that with the coronavirus and how quickly we have seen how fragile many of the sort of many of the sort of things we consider normal can easily just like that be seen as just something that like our vestiges or a bygone era. I mean, many of the things we recently had considered going out saying are now greatly changed. And I think that that's something that shows how fluid the situation is and will be talked about further, but also is something that really emphasizes why this is an issue that needs to be further discussed. And hopefully this segment, despite its length, I think is something that you have found all interesting. And I will definitely revisit this sometime soon. I'm definitely going to have another segment up actually regarding the KMT and its sort of bizarre situation that I think we can actually learn a lot when it comes to the GOP here in the United States, the good old Republicans, or the grand old party, the Republicans, who I, as you know, can tell you am not the hugest fan of, along with the Democrats and much of the contemporary political system here. However, I do think that there is reforms that could potentially be made, and I think that it is important still to have a reality-based, contextualized approach here. I'll give my own perspectives from time to time. I'm not one to shy away from op-eds. However, I think regardless of my own opinions, we need to transcend our own selves and look at the broader circumstances and the conditions that are ultimately shaping the socio-political circumstances we have that also go beyond just those and go from the things that we do out in the ordinary times or that we have. For me, I like to longboard and do a lot of things like reading, exercising, hanging out with a girlfriend, doing that type of stuff, going out and having a place that is one that I would feel comfortable raising my children in, which isn't in question right now. However, in the future, as I want to have kids eventually, that is a future tense sort of thing. I think that it is good to keep in mind that it is up to those here now that will ultimately determine what is in the future. But in order to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we came from. And that is why I am someone who is a student of history, someone who discusses world history and also international relations. I believe both go hand in hand and both need to be properly integrated in terms of what we're using for our tools of analysis and how we come to our conclusions and, sift through the increasing malaise and, alternate sort of factual era that we're living in, where the idea of alternate facts is even a thing, and we are even fundamentally not able to agree, at least on a domestic level in the United States, considering how polarized we are on simple things like what is the truth and all these other concepts that we often in the past could have easily taken, I think, for granted. But with that being said, and a broader discussion that I think should be worth keeping in mind, that I'll put a little bit of a bookmark here for a future segment. I think that this is all, something that you should, again, keep in mind and will be discussed in the future. I appreciate you all tuning in for this segment, depending on when you've been tuning into it. Let me know what you think. If you agree, disagree. If you did support the show and want to further, expand my capacity to schedule future content of this kind and others that you might enjoy, please consider contributing to my Patreon or GoFundMe. And I will also have other links to social media and things that I have not had the time to use, but however will start to try to use again soon. And, listen, I really appreciate if you have listened to the end here, tuning into this, as I've not nearly enough time to solidify, again, as I mentioned earlier, a schedule that I am looking forward to, especially with such important events unfolding, coming back and having these types of discussions. And I'm looking forward to hearing what all you have to think and hopefully building up this channel and podcast here. I'm actually planning on launching a blog soon that I will be writing related articles such as for these types of topics. I'll probably have the Taiwan source situation as one of my first major pieces, and I'll include links to all that type of stuff below. And again, please, if you haven't already and are interested in this type of content, subscribe, support, and click the bell notification if you subscribed on YouTube to not miss out on content uploads. And on my podcast, do the sorts of things like grab the RSS feed or click the follow button if you're viewing this on Google or Apple Podcast. But you know all that already, and thank you again for tuning in. This has been Tom from Get Nuanced. I'll catch you all in the next segment I make real soon. For now, stay safe and peace out.